2024 is coming to an end, and on this channel we're going to end it the way we started, talking about some of the most popular fantasy books out there. And guys, there's one super popular book that I just did not like. Please join the conversation. The very first video that we did on this channel was one called 6 of the Best Fantasy Books of All Time. And the focus of that was the must-read authors of the genre: Tolkien, Martin, Michael Moorcock, Terry Pratchett, etc. Now, I have a confession to make. My view of the genre has been historically very, very narrow. You see, growing up, I loved Tolkien, I loved Robert E. Howard, and I loved Terry Pratchett so much that I didn't really want to give other new authors or more contemporary authors a fair shot. It was a classic case of cutting off my own nose to spite my face. So as I grew up, I got married and moved away and built a career and all that kind of stuff. So rather than reading more in that genre, I set it aside and cherished those authors and read other stuff. But this channel now is giving me a chance to make amends for that. So over the past few months, I've been reading some of the most popular books in fantasy to kind of catch up. And now I can roll those up into the channel's best of lists. Now, obviously, that's going to take some time. So as a roadmap, I'm using Goodreads and some of their best of lists as to help me make selections on what to read next. I'm also using comments made by you all in the comment sections of these videos. So please let me know what your favorite fantasy books are, and I can roll those in as well. Now, Goodreads has a couple of lists. I'm using the one called the most popular fantasy on Goodreads. And when you look at that list, you see, and similar lists, you'll see that a couple of names typically dominate them. Tolkien, Rowling, and Brandon Sanderson in particular usually show up and pack those top 10 lists. Now, for the purposes of our best of fantasy lists, we are going to exclude urban and contemporary fantasy. Now, that's not a judgment call on that particular type of subgenre. Actually, some of my favorite fantasy books, The Long Dark Deep Time of the Soul, Good Omens, can qualify as contemporary or urban fantasy. But if someone comes up to me and asks for a suggestion on good fantasy, that's not the type of book that I'm going to recommend. It's going to be something that takes place in another world and another time, etc. So what that really means, though, is I'm excluding Harry Potter from the list, the J.K. Rowling books. And again, it's not because they're not good books. It's because they just don't fit into what we're doing here. So by setting that aside, we're going to look at the top 6 books recommended by Goodreads as the most popular books in fantasy. So let's get to it. Number 1, The Name of the Wind by Patrick Rothfuss. I can't tell you how excited I was to read this book. When I first started looking into the best of fantasy books on Goodreads, I was shocked to find that the number 1 name on a lot of these lists was not Tolkien, but Patrick Rothfuss in The Name of the Wind. So I immediately ordered the book, and when I got it, I was looking at the little quotes that they have on the back of the book, and there's some big names on there vouching for this book. Ursula K. Le Guin, Orson Scott Card, Terry Brooks. And so I was really, really stoked on this, but I was shocked to find I was really disappointed in this book. It's kind of a paradox for me because it's exceptionally well written. Rothfuss is obviously a skilled writer, and you can tell that this book was lovingly written, and the story is so well developed. The fantasy world is solid and historically interesting. You know, something a lot of fantasy books, I think, don't do so well with is developing the world that the story is telling into where you as a reader get a sense that there's more going on than just the story you're being led to. And I think that leads to a much more rich experience when you're reading fantasy books. And Rothfuss does that. His world is obviously well thought out and I think complex, which is fantastic. But I didn't care about the protagonist's struggle. It starts out well enough. We're introduced into this small town where this demonic creature attacks somebody, and the main character, a guy by the name of Kvothe, well, we learned his name is Kvothe. He's actually taken on the guise of a local tavern owner. We get introduced to him and his role as apparently a larger-than-life hero, but who's kind of faded off the scene, as it were. And he's discovered by someone called the Chronicler, and Kvothe is spends the entire book. He agrees to reveal his life story to kind of set the record straight on who he was and who he is. What we find is that the story, even though it starts it up within the context of there's some kind of demonic creature that's attacked, and Kvothe is obviously got the powers to fight some of these forces, we go backwards in time and we start hearing his life story and how he became this legendary, larger than life hero. But in my opinion, the story goes into tedious detail. We're exposed to the life of a young child who is wise beyond his years and very, very intelligent, who learns the rules of magic, of sympathy, and whose family is torn away from him by demonic forces that he wants to learn more about. And those are some of the highlights that we're exposed to. But some of his struggles dealing with academia and some of his fellow students and puberty, frankly, it doesn't interest me, and I couldn't get myself to care enough about his struggles. So the story is obviously leading to a much bigger payoff, right? And I can appreciate that, but I, for one, was not really caring so much about his inability to read the girl that he likes, and that it just didn't hold the interest for me. So those of you who are fans of the Kingslayer Chronicle, I think the larger series is called, apologize. I'm sorry, I just didn't get into the book. It took me like 6 weeks to read. I was just really, really not into the whole story. I can tell though that there might be a bigger payoff later. And so let me know, should I stick with the series? But right now, even though this is number 1 on all these lists, it's not number 1 on mine. Number 2 is The Fellowship of the Ring by J.R.R. Tolkien. And if you saw the first video that we produced on this, you know the high opinion I have on this book. I think I mentioned in that first video that the New York Times did a survey of its readers, and The Fellowship of the Ring was ranked number 2 of all fiction books of all time. And I am there with it. I think as far as fantasy goes, it is the best fantasy book out there. With the books, the popularity of the books, and of course the movies and all the games and everything else, it seems ridiculous to go over the plot of The Fellowship of the Ring, The Two Towers, and The Return of the King. So I'm not going to belabor those points, but I will say that the thing that I believe that Tolkien does that really resonates and that really helps shape the fantasy genre for decades to come is that he created this narrative of having kind of 2 forces for good. You had the powerful, you had the wizards and the kings and of old who came back to battle the ancient evils, and they're necessary, and they're part of the exciting part of the narrative. But then you also had the common folk, the person who rises up out of everyday stock, who can stand up to evil. The Lord of the Rings would not be the Lord of the Rings without Bilbo and Frodo and the hobbits who rise up to the moment, who, even though the powers of good have marshaled and are ready to face and fight and perish in the face of ultimate evil, that the crux of victory comes from the heart of the hobbits. And so that balance of the excitement of your traditional heroics of your warriors and your wizards, and the just the good nature victory that comes from the hobbits, that balance is just what the Fellowship of the Ring, the Two Towers, and ultimately the Lord of the Rings, the whole Lord of the Rings, the Return of the King, the whole Lord of the Rings narrative. That's what he does so well. One of the things I think that helped turn me away from other contemporary writers is this tendency to have the focus be exclusively on the powerful mages or the powerful story heroes, which can be entertaining, yes, but again, it's Tolkien's ability to balance those 2 parts of a story out. He also developed this whole long journey part of the story. I think maybe he didn't invent it, of course, but he, I think, made it to where it was hard to break away from that kind of story. So other books and other authors found themselves maybe inadvertently copying that because Tolkien did it so well. So the Fellowship of the Ring kind of was the supernova, or the Big Bang, if you will, of Middle Earth. It took the Hobbit, which was this charming wonderful story and just exploded it out to where we can enjoy the world of Middle-earth for decades to come. So in my list, The Fellowship of the Ring is number 1. Number 3, as I mentioned before, is The Hobbit. I'm not going to spend a whole lot of time on there again, except to say that if for some reason all you ever saw of your only exposure to The Hobbit was the movies, and you hadn't read the book, please read the book, because I think that the Hobbit movies are really, really bad. The book is just this really engaging story that, as I mentioned with The Fellowship of the Ring, that pits the good-natured Bilbo Baggins alongside with these dwarves of mixed motivations to go across the world to the other side of Middle-earth as far as Bilbo is concerned, and to the Lonely Mountain and face the dragon Smog. It's basically a very simple premise, but the complexity of the story, where you have simple Bilbo drawn into this complex world. It's just fun to read. It's not quite as dark and gritty as The Lord of the Rings, but it's not without its own suspense. And the story is just so well told that The Hobbit deserves to be on any top 10, in my opinion, top 5 list. Number 4 on the list, G.R.R. Martin, Game of Thrones. In a way, I think G.R.R. Martin helped to redefine and expand the fantasy genre away from Tolkien-esque style. He took the fundamentals of fantasy, the world building, magic, the motivations of greed and thirst for power versus the more noble aspirations of protagonists. He took all that stuff, all the basic necessities of fantasy, but he told the story in a grittier and more visceral and, in a way, more realistic kind of light. His storytelling is definitely not Tolkien-esque, but he did it in a way that was engaging and fully enjoyable when it comes to fantasy style books. So G.R.R. Martin really does a fantastic job. Game of Thrones is definitely a favorite of mine, and obviously the subsequent series that was based off has opened the doors or introduced it to so many folks who may not even have read the books. Real quick, just to kind of set the stage for the discussion, the Game of Thrones is set in Westeros and the Seven Kingdoms. We're introduced to the king who rules over these 7 kingdoms, and he knows that these kingdoms are ruled by vipers, and he doesn't really trust anyone except for his friend Ned Stark, who rules in the north. He calls on his friend to come and serve him as his hand, his number 1 guy, to help rule the kingdom. And that brings the Starks, who really just want to be left alone, into this world of intrigue and blood and betrayal, and sets the stage for the entire series. What stands out to me about A Game of Thrones, one of the things that stands out to me about Game of Thrones, is how the fantastic, like magic and dragons, bear with me a second, don't really come into it at first. It's very much a realistic sort of setting, though it does start off with a fantastic, right? The very beginning of the book starts off north of the Wall, which is that fortification up in the north that's set up to keep out the wildings and the White Walkers, right? And the White Walkers are almost forgotten, and a lot of folks don't even believe that they exist at this point in Westeros' history. But when you first start reading A Game of Thrones, those don't come into play as much as they will down the road. But it's still that hint, that suggestion that it's out there, that gets slowly drawn in as you read the story. I think was so well done and so enjoyable that it really makes A Game of Thrones of a different character than subsequent books and a lot of other fantasy. So if you're looking for if you haven't read it and you're looking for fantasy and you're not sure and you don't want just a Tolkien clone, Game of Thrones is the book for you. And again, I totally agree that it deserves to be on anybody's best of top 10 list. Number 5 on the Goodreads list is The Final Empire, number 1 of the Mistborn series by Brandon Sanderson. You can't go to any bookstore fantasy section without seeing tons of Brandon Sanderson books. I had not read any of his books, and to be fair, I'm only about a third of the way through The Final Empire right now. And so far, what I'm reading, I'm enjoying. It's creative, it's imaginative, it's full of action, but I'm not sure it deserves to be on a top 5 or even a top 10 list yet. Now, I'm totally open to it. I can see why it could, and I'll definitely update this list once I'm finished with it. But the only reason why I hedge my bet a little bit on this is that you can tell that this is one of Brent Sanderson's earliest works. There are conventions in this book that kind of bother me, that kind of stand out, that I'm sure that he gets better at doing as he writes more and more, and which of course he's written tons of books since then. But the premise of this book is intriguing. I love the magic, the system of magic that we're introduced to is pretty fascinating. So for those of you who haven't read, and just these are all no spoilers, the world that we're introduced to here is ruled over by someone called the Lord Ruler. He's immortal. Apparently, he's unkillable. At least that's the belief out there. And it's kind of divided between a nobility, which are the people who supported the Lord Ruler years and years before when he conquered, and the common folks, and these people are called Ska. And the Ska are treated a little better than animals. They're enslaved, and they're made to do all the dirty work. The Lord Ruler had rewarded nobility by giving them these powers, something called allomancy. And what that did was, if you ingested certain metals, there are these 7 metals that provided you 7 different powers, and you burned it. The metals inside of you, and you concentrated, and it gave you the ability to get strength and heightened senses and that sort of thing. Well, over the years, many, many years, most nobility had kind of forgotten how to use these powers, and those that remembered or still had the ability to use these powers could only do one of the 7 powers. And those were called mistings. Those people were called mistings. But occasionally someone would come along who can do all 7, and those were called Mistborn. But over the years, also, some of the nobility wound up crossbreeding with the Ska, which you're not supposed to do. It's a big no-no. And so what wound up happening, at least in the context of the story that we're reading here, is that there are some Ska who have some of these powers as well, some of this allomancy. Most of them are misting, so they can only control 1 power. But then you have a couple that we're introduced to here that are Mistborn. They can control up to all the 7 metals, 7 powers. So the story setup is interesting. The characters are engaging, and it's a lot of fun to read. So I'm fully expecting this to keep its place in the top 10 list. But right now, I'm just a little hesitant. I'd like to know, for those of you who are fans of Sanderson and the Mistborn series, what you think of it, where it places in the top 10. So leave a comment if you would. Number 6 is The Return of the King by J.R.R. Tolkien. Obviously, Tolkien is a huge presence on this list. I think he deserves to be there. The Return of the King just does this masterful job of wrapping up this whole Lord of the Rings story. I know some people think that the ending of The Return of the King kind of drug on and should have ended a little earlier. I disagreed with that. I did not want to leave Middle-earth at all, and I remember being heartbroken when I finally had to close the book because I was finished the story. I'm one of those guys who read all the appendices. So The Return of the King is number 6 on the Goodreads list, again, excluding the Harry Potter books. The Return of the King deserves to be on, I think, every top 10 list. The whole Lord of the Rings saga. If you want to cheat and you just compress it into the Lord of the Rings, I think the Lord of the Rings deserves to be number 1 on best fantasy books. But breaking them out like this, definitely on the top 10 list. The Return of the King as the climax and resolution of the story, I think, does right by all the main characters. If your main exposure has been in the movies, I think you'd be very satisfied with the way each of the characters are developed and resolved by the end of the book. I think it's touching, it's exciting. The whole Lord of the Rings trilogy is just I think there's a reason why we all know about it, and it's going to keep its place on the D3R top 10 list and belongs, and it's right that it's on the Goodreads list as well. So I agree with that 100%. So this last one is kind of a bonus. Now, this book is not on the top 10. It's not on the top 50. If you look at the most popular fantasy Goodreads list, is number 95, at least last time I checked. But if you go to the Goodreads High Fantasy Best of list, you'll see that it's in the top 10 there. It is The Lies of Locke Lamore by Scott Lynch. This book is a real gem. I am having more fun reading this book than I have many books over the last few years. Published in 2006, is the first of the Gentleman Bastard series. In tone, it's more related to, say, Game of Thrones than it is Tolkien. It is absolutely not Tolkien-esque in any way, but it's got everything that you want from a fantasy world. The storytelling is fantastic, and in tone, it's kind of akin to Game of Thrones meets up with Discworld. Hold on, let me explain. It's not that it's funny. There are some genuinely funny parts on here. Most of the story takes place in a city called Comor. And Comor is more or less based, it seems like, on a fantasy medieval version of Venice, Italy. And it's really neat. This difference in setting from a lot of fantasy books is really, I think, really well done in the story. Locke Lamore is a thief. He is the chief thief of a small gang of thieves called the Gentleman Bastards, who operate within a network of other thieves and gangs, right? All under a chieftain kind of thief as well. But the arrangement in this is that the thieves operate in this under something called the secret peace with the nobility, the Duke of the city of Comor. And the way this works is they can operate under certain restrictions. They're not allowed to attack the nobility or anything excessive or the Duke's forces, but they can operate on each other. They can operate on the merchants and that sort of thing. It kind of reminds me of Discworld and the guild arrangement that Lord Vetinari had set up within Ankh-Morpork, right? With the Assassins Guild and the Thieves Guild and the quotas they have on the amount of thievery they can do so long as they pay their taxes. This story is violent and it is raw, meaning that I noticed in some of the reviews of it, because I like to see what other folks had to say, some folks knocked it down a little bit on their ratings because they thought it was just too violent and too descriptive. And there is that. If you read this book, you know what you're getting into. There's violence, there's lots of swearing, there's a little bit of sexual innuendo, but I'm almost done with the book right now, and there have been few books that I've read over the last few years that I have been almost gasping and distraught over what's happening to the characters. They're just relatable characters somehow. It's just really enjoyable, and it is making my way quickly to my top 10 list. So if you've read The Lies of Locke Lamore or any of the Gentleman Bastard books, let me know what you think. Am I crazy? Am I just too close to it right now? Because I'm really enjoying the story. So if you've read any of the Gentleman Bastard books, let me know. Do you think it's as good as I do? Because I'm really just enjoying it. But it's on my top 10 list of books right now. So that's it, guys. Goodreads has number 1 being The Name of the Wind, number 2, Fellowship of the Ring, 3, The Hobbit, 4, A Game of Thrones, 5, The Final Empire, and 6, Return of the King. But at D3R, we've decided to rate them as number 1, The Fellowship of the Ring, 2, The Return of the King, 3, The Hobbit, 4, Game of Thrones, 5, Mistborn, 6, The Lies of Locke Lamore, and 7, The Name of the Wind. So let me know what you think. Do you agree with this arrangement? What would you have in your top, now 7, fantasy book lists? And thanks so much for joining the conversation, and keep on reading. We'll see you next time.